How's it going, folks? Welcome back to another alternate history scenario. The focus of this video today is the nation of Ethiopia. Without further ado, let's get into it. Long ago, in the midst of Europe's dark ages, there existed a legend that spoke of a distant Christian kingdom, cut off from the rest of Christendom by the rise of the Islamic caliphates and pagans in the lands beyond Europe. This kingdom was said to be ruled by a man named Prester John, or Prester John in English. Prester John was said to be a descendant of the three kings who'd visited Jesus Christ after his birth. Prester John's kingdom, said to be a strange land full of untold wonders and riches, was long sought after. Some said it was in South Asia, others in Central Asia, and others yet theorized it was somewhere in the continent of Africa. Now, was the legend of Prester John a tall tale fabricated to give Christendom comfort amidst the successes and glory of the Islamic Golden Age? Yes. Yes, it was. However, far away from Europe, in East Africa, the cradle of humanity, lay a very real Christian empire, the Ethiopian Empire. Ethiopia is one of Africa's oldest nations. In this ancient land, many kingdoms, tribes, and nations rose and fell throughout the ages. In 1270 AD, Tesfa Iyasus, a warrior and noble who claimed to be the descendant of Solomon, the king of Israel, led a revolt against Ethiopia's ruling dynasty, the Zagwe dynasty. Tesfa Iyasus would defeat the Zagwe dynasty and become the emperor of Ethiopia, founding the Solomonic dynasty, which would rule Ethiopia for the next 700 years, as well as setting Ethiopia on course to dominate East Africa for centuries to come, and ushering in a golden age for Ethiopian arts and literature. Later Solomonic emperors would lead a brutal campaign to eliminate paganism and cement Christianity as the dominant faith in the region, as well as make contact with the monarchs of Europe, who were convinced that the then emperor Constantinos I was literally Prester John, despite his envoys denying this and being very confused why their emperor was being called Prester John. The following centuries would see the Ethiopian Empire survive multiple incursions from outside tribes and nations, maintaining the nation's territorial integrity for the most part. However, the biggest danger facing Ethiopia by the 19th century was sectarian violence fueled by the presence of numerous distinct ethnic groups within the empire who did not get along. In tandem with the interethnic conflict, the Ethiopian Empire also suffered from governmental infighting as well as external pressure from its Muslim neighbors and the European imperial powers, who by the late 1800s were rapidly devouring the African continent and absorbing its land into their colonial empires. Thankfully, Ethiopia was blessed with successive competent emperors, those being Johannes IV and Menelik II, who would guide Ethiopia through this chaotic period of African history, rejuvenating and expanding the empire's territory and beginning modernization efforts. However, in 1895, the scramble for Africa reached Ethiopia in the form of Italian imperialism. Italy would create a justification for future aggression by dishonestly inserting into the Italian version of a bilateral Italo-Ethiopian treaty wording that stated Ethiopia accepted its status as an Italian protectorate. However, in the Amharic version, Amharic being the official language of the Ethiopian Empire, it was only stated that Ethiopia would recognize Italian control over Eritrea, the region to the north of the empire. Upon learning of the Italians' deception, the Ethiopian Empire refused to obey the terms of a treaty they had not signed, and thus Italy decided to use military force to subdue and colonize the empire. Unfortunately for the Italians, all of Ethiopia, including warlords from different ethnicities, rallied around Emperor Menelik II, who had spent his reign rapidly modernizing the nation as well as amassing modern weaponry. The result was the Italians facing a numerically superior modern Ethiopian military. After just over a year of fighting, in 1896, Italy lost the war. The loss of a European colonial power to an African nation came as a shock to Europe. Italy was consumed by riots and infighting sparked by every Italian politician seeking to avoid blame for this military catastrophe, while Ethiopia cemented its right to exist and was accordingly recognized by Britain and France, neither of whom wished for Ethiopia to intervene in their nearby colonies' internal affairs. During an era where tragically, almost all of Africa was subjugated under European colonial rule, Ethiopia entered the 20th century as a sovereign nation determined to continually better itself. A new era for the nation began in 1930, when Emperor Haile Selassie I ascended to the throne of the Ethiopian Empire. a young, reform-minded leader, Haile Selassie I would introduce Ethiopia's first written constitution and put the nation on track to gradual democratization, as at the time, much power still lay in the hands of the Ethiopian nobility. Likewise, the emperor would also begin to modernize the nation's education system. However, this new era was cut short in 1935, when Italy, now under the rule of Benito Mussolini, and eager to avenge their shameful defeat 40 years prior, senselessly attacked Ethiopia without so much as a declaration of war, using chemical weapons as well. Ethiopia, which had been restricted when it came to arms shipments from European powers in the years following their victory in 1895, was now outnumbered and outgunned by the Italians, with nearly 300,000 Ethiopian soldiers perishing in the initial conflict. With a heavy heart and defeat in sight, Emperor Haile Selassie I fled into exile with the imperial family on May 2, 1936. Addis Ababa, the capital, would fall on May 5th to Italian forces. The following years would see the emperor continue to advocate for his nation from exile in the UK, while the Ethiopian people struggled relentlessly against the Italian occupation. The turning point for Ethiopia would come with the beginning of World War II, as its enemy, Italy, was now also the enemy of the UK and France. After a hard-fought campaign won with the blood of the Ethiopians and their allies, on May 5, 1941, Emperor Haile Selassie would triumphantly re-enter Addis Ababa. The end of the Italian occupation and the restoration of Ethiopian sovereignty would soon follow. Following the end of World War II, Ethiopia would enter the Atomic Era as a Western-aligned monarchy, which benefited them greatly in the beginning of the Cold War and during the era of decolonization. For instance, in 1952, the land of Eritrea, under British control since its seizure from the Italians in 1941, was ceded and placed under Ethiopian control, expanding the size of the empire and giving it a coastline. Eritrea, under a plan from the United Nations, was originally supposed to merely exist in a federation with Ethiopia while retaining its own parliament and semi-autonomous rule. However, instead, the emperor made Eritrea a province of Ethiopia, denying them any semblance of autonomy or control. This led to immense tension, which would boil over in the coming years. The 1950s would see the development of higher education in Ethiopia, as well as a new constitution in 1955. This new governing document, while preserving the absolute power of the emperor, also introduced the concept of separation of powers to the nation's government and expanded the role of the Ethiopian parliament, with a general election, dominated by aristocrats, occurring 2 years later. Within my last sentence is elucidated the core of the Ethiopian Empire's issues. The nation was ready for progress, had the means to achieve it, and yet it was consistently held back by the monarchy, performing a sort of tightrope act. You see, the emperor began his reign as a reformer, yet his notions of what reform should constitute failed to adjust to the new political realities of the post-war era. For instance, he helped many of his subjects to become educated, only for this to cause tension when politically literate Ethiopians criticized his government. Ethiopia supported the decolonization of Africa, whilst concurrently brutally suppressing a nascent movement for independence amongst the people of Eritrea. Behind this dissonance of realities lay the truth that the empire was beginning to stagnate under the emperor's stifling of further political liberalization and refusal to share political power. Political parties and autonomous political organizations, traditionally avatars of non-violent political change, for better or for worse, were non-existent within the empire. Any form of protest, again, a traditional method for effecting change without violence, was also forbidden. Imperial spies kept the population in line, and even the ruling class began to take issue with how the emperor was running the nation. While the capital of Addis Ababa reached new heights of glory, the rest of the nation languished in poverty. The first serious sign of the Ethiopian Empire's decline came on December 13, 1960, when, during the emperor's state visit to Brazil, a group of dissatisfied military leaders attempted to overthrow the emperor and replace him with his son, Crown Prince Asfa Wossen. The coup attempt was driven by the reality that, in order for Ethiopia to progress, new leadership was needed, since the emperor still wielded near absolute power. It is still debated whether the crown prince was sincere in his participation in the coup or was coerced to do so by the military. Regardless, the coup failed and 300 people perished in the aftermath. Although the emperor emerged victorious, he was, in a sense, weaker than ever, since now his government ruled solely through fear, its legitimacy relying completely on the attitude of the military toward the monarch. And if the military were ever to change its opinion on the monarch, well, that would never happen, surely. The emperor's focus had fully shifted from overseeing progress to staying in power no matter the cost. The 1960s were a tumultuous time for the empire, beginning in 1961 with the outbreak of the Eritrean War of Independence, fomented by the region's loss of autonomy and denial of any avenues for peaceful political change. While having to combat the Eritrean rebels, the weight of Ethiopia's stagnation began to reveal itself, as many of the nation's students and academics turned against the imperial government and its slow pace of progress. Efforts by the emperor to institute further land reform, for instance, were halted by conservative members of his own court, who dissuaded him from instituting such reforms for fear of instigating a mass rebellion by the nobility. Ethiopia, to put it succinctly, was stuck. In 1972, another blow to the empire came when the Wollo region was struck by a massive famine, which would go on to ultimately kill around 250,000 Ethiopians. This major famine had been preceded by two smaller famines in the past, both of which had received a slow and unhelpful government response, and the Wollo famine was no different. The initial causes of the famine was drought and crop failure in the region. However, this instigating event was compounded by a slow government response, as well as local government cover-ups of its extent and the resulting socio-political tensions which arose between the people of the Wollo region and the imperial government. Exports of grain from the Wollo region bafflingly continued even as the famine raged on. Military mutinies and peasant revolts became ever increasing due to the strain put on the local authorities to maintain order, only for the 1973 oil crisis to occur, leading to further economic devastation. With the people of the Wollo region died much of the nation's remaining goodwill towards the emperor, and his reputation as a dependable and capable leader was damaged irreparably. By early 1974, the Ethiopian Empire was on its last legs. On January 12, 1974, portions of the Ethiopian military stationed south of the capital of Addis Ababa revolted against the imperial government, and this initial rebellion soon grew into nationwide protests against the emperor. By June 1974, as a response to the unrest, a group of communists within the military formed a military junta known as the Derg, named after the Amharic word for committee, whose stated goal was revolution and the toppling of the emperor. The wave of progress begun by him had long ago outpaced the emperor, who now found himself left behind. By the end of June, the Derg had seized power, with the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Endelkachu Makonnen, fleeing to Djibouti in July, and Emperor Haile Selassie being arrested in September 1974. Following the emperor's arrest, the Derg would suspend the Ethiopian constitution and establish a communist state, thus ending the 704-year-old Ethiopian Empire and beginning the era of Derg rule in Ethiopia. In the early days of their rule, the Derg would execute 59 imperial officials, culminating in the murder of Emperor Haile Selassie on August 27, 1975. In this new era, Brigadier General Tafari Benti would emerge as the new leader of Ethiopia, for a little bit. However, after less than 3 years in power, Benti would be toppled and killed by one of his subordinates, Lieutenant Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam, who in 1977 would emerge as the new leader of communist Ethiopia after murdering and purging his other political rivals. Without any viable opposition, Mengistu would quickly consolidate power and transform Ethiopia into a totalitarian dictatorship. Under Mengistu, Ethiopia would nationalize all land owned by the Ethiopian Church and landlords, forge close ties with other communist nations, and cut military ties with the United States to forge a new military alliance with the Soviet Union. For all of Mengistu's belief in radical change, even with the emperor gone, however, communist Ethiopia still intended to maintain its grip over Eritrea, whose rebels were still intent on rebelling against whichever Ethiopian government was in power, regardless of their political leanings. As the war in Eritrea intensified in the mid-1970s, the neighboring country of Somalia, which had long coveted Ethiopia's Ogaden region due to its large Somali population, launched an invasion of eastern Ethiopia with the intent of annexing the Ogaden region into Greater Somalia. The impetus for the invasion, according to those close to Somali dictator at the time, Siad Barre, was the regime change in Ethiopia. While Siad Barre had been unwilling to risk a fight with the Western-backed empire, communist Ethiopia seemed much more unstable, thus giving Siad Barre confidence in the success of a possible military invasion. The Ogaden War would exact a heavy toll on both nations, and after 8 months of war and instrumental Soviet and Cuban support for Ethiopia, in March 1978, Somalia would capitulate and withdraw in defeat. However, the end of the war for Ethiopia was far from a return to peace. Concurrent to the war was the Keshibir, or Ethiopian Red Terror, in which hundreds of thousands of political opponents, including rival communists, would be systematically murdered by the Mengistu regime, among other atrocities. The misery would only continue for the people of Ethiopia with the dawn of the 1980s. In 1983, caused by a combination of horrific drought and terrible agricultural policy decisions, Ethiopia would enter a period of famine lasting until 1985, which would kill roughly 1 million Ethiopians. With government oppression only further increasing after the famine, by 1989, all of the anti-government factions in Ethiopia and Eritrea had put aside their political and ethnic differences and united under the banner of the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, or the EPRDF. This would escalate the numerous regional conflicts into a nationwide civil war, and on May 28, 1991, the EPRDF would capture the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa. As for Mengistu, the cowardly dictator would flee Ethiopia for exile in Zimbabwe, where he lives to this day despite multiple attempts to extradite him back to Ethiopia so that he may face justice for his crimes. Following the fall of the Derg, Eritrea would gain independence as Ethiopia relinquished its claims to the region and turned inward to focus on rebuilding. Unfortunately for Eritrea, quickly following their independence, the nation's new leader, Isaias Afwerki, would quickly dismantle the young nation's chances for democracy and turn Eritrea into a totalitarian state. Afwerki remains in power as of December 2025. The rest of the 1990s would see Ethiopia slowly rebuild as the nation transitioned to democracy. However, democracy is messy, even more so in diverse nations like Ethiopia, with many competing tribal and ethnic groups and interests. To maintain national cohesion, Ethiopia would adopt a model of ethnic federalism to prevent further ethnic conflict. However, despite these efforts, by the mid-2000s, cracks would begin to form in the nation's stability. The 2005 election would see accusations of fraud and political violence erupt across the nation. The 2010 election would be marred by similar accusations. The rest of the 2010s would see worsening droughts across the nation, and 2016 in particular would see mass protests against the Ethiopian government across the Oromia region, with up to 500 people presumed killed in the ensuing violence. A state of emergency would be declared that same year, lifted in 2017, then reimposed in 2018. In April 2018, Abiy Ahmed was elected the new Prime Minister of Ethiopia. Under his leadership, Ethiopia would see some initial reforms, which were unfortunately quickly followed by the outbreak of war in Ethiopia's Tigray region, sparked by tensions between the Ethiopian government and the local Tigray authorities over issues of regional sovereignty. The late 2010s and early 2020s would only see further clashes and ethnic conflict across the country, an attempted coup d'etat, and the COVID-19 pandemic. As of 2025, multiple ethnic conflicts continue to ravage Ethiopia alongside other pressing issues like democratic backsliding, poverty, and human rights violations. The 20th century and 21st century have not been kind to the ancient land of Ethiopia. This much is clear. But what if things went differently? What if the Ethiopian Empire survived into the present day? Our point of divergence comes in 1935 amidst the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, which would begin on October 3, 1935. Just as in our timeline, the Italian army, led by General Emilio de Bono, would attack unprovoked from their colony in Eritrea. On November 8th, the Italians would advance close to the city of Makalle in Ethiopia's Tigray region, stretching their supply lines perilously thin. At this point in the war, supplies had to travel 200 kilometers from Italian Eritrea to the front line in Ethiopia. Had the Ethiopians defended Makalle at this point, they could have cut off and surrounded General de Bono's army. However, in our timeline, the Ethiopians never got the chance to attempt this maneuver thanks to the actions of Commander Haile Selassie Gugsa, a noble with a similar name to the emperor whom, henceforth, I shall refer to simply as Commander Gugsa to prevent confusion. Now, in our timeline, Gugsa was tasked with the defense of Makalle and the Tigray region as a whole by the emperor. Instead, the cowardly Gugsa surrendered and defected to the side of the Italian imperialists. Because Gugsa and his men were the main force defending Makalle, their betrayal left it largely undefended in the face of the Italian army's advance. However, in this alternate timeline, instead, Gugsa decides not to betray his nation to the Italians. Instead of defecting nearly immediately in October of 1935, Gugsa and his force of 1,200 men would instead follow the emperor's orders and engage in an organized retreat to Makalle, allowing the Italians to believe they were cautiously advancing when, in fact, this was all part of the Ethiopian strategy. On November 8, 1935, the Italians, numbering around 30,000, would reach Makalle, where Gugsa and his men would make their stand. The Battle of Makalle would begin as Gugsa and his men, fighting to the end, would bog down the Italian offensive for a few days by fighting to the last man and halt any further progress for the time being. The Italians would be forced to dig in at Makalle. After 3 days of intense fighting, Gugsa's defenses would collapse, with 1,056 of the defenders, including Gugsa himself, dying in battle. But victory had not been their purpose. Just as the Italians were about to take Makalle, a united force of Ethiopians led by Hailu Tekle Haimanot and Sayum Mangasha would fall upon them with a force of around 20,000 men and destroy their supply lines, encircling them. The Italians, while enjoying numerical and technological superiority, were nevertheless cut off from any form of resupply. To prevent the defeat of his army, on November 20th, General Debono would organize a breakout from Makalle to regroup along the Mareb River. In the chaotic breakout which followed the siege of Makalle, General Debono himself would accidentally be killed by friendly fire as the Italians hurried their disengagement. The victory at Makalle would be one of Ethiopia's greatest victories in the war and would represent a crucial setback for the Italians. Likewise, the example set by Gugsa and his defenders would move the emperor greatly and inspire him to continue the struggle no matter the cost. However, this battle alone would not define the war. Despite the costly loss of General Debono, Mussolini would appoint General Pietro Badoglio the supreme commander of Italian forces in Ethiopia. From the victory at Makalle, the course of the war would shift in favor of the Ethiopians, who would capitalize on this to begin a Christmas offensive in December 1935, just as they had attempted in our timeline. The Christmas offensive, lasting until 1936, would see the Italians push back from their positions of maximal territorial gain back toward the Eritrean border. However, in January, General Badoglio, now in command, would authorize the widespread deployment of mustard gas and other chemical weapons to crush the Ethiopians and win the war quickly, just as in our timeline. Throughout January, countless villages across Ethiopia would be attacked and massacred by Italian chemical weapons. Italian aircraft, using special equipment for distributing chemical weaponry, would not distinguish between soldiers, women, animals, or children, killing thousands and poisoning vast swaths of Ethiopian land. February and early March would see the Italians swiftly advance throughout Ethiopia, putting the Imperial armed forces on the back foot and turning the tide of the war back in Italy's favor. On March 24, 1936, Emperor Haile Selassie himself would take command of the Imperial armed forces and meet General Badoglio in the town of Mechu in the Tigray region. The Ethiopian attack would inflict heavy casualties on the Italians, yet it would still not be enough to win the battle. After days of brutal fighting, on April 2nd, Emperor Haile Selassie would be forced to order a retreat, having expended the nation's last major military forces keeping the Italians from Addis Ababa. However, having inflicted heavier casualties on the Italians, the retreat would be far more organized than in our timeline. When, on April 21st, the emperor finally returned from the front to the capital of Addis Ababa, he would find a city on edge. He would send word for his son, Crown Prince Asfawosen, and order him to retreat from the front as well. Soon, all remaining Ethiopian forces would find themselves concentrated in Addis Ababa. Amidst this rapidly deteriorating security situation, Emperor Haile Selassie would make a difficult decision. In order to safeguard the continued existence of the Ethiopian Empire, the imperial family would have to flee the nation into exile. However, unlike in our timeline, while Emperor Haile Selassie would still send his family to the UK, he himself would choose to stay behind, not to be captured, but to lead the imperial armed forces through the transition from active combat to insurgency. This was partly inspired by news of the last stand at Makalle. If Gugsa, a man never well liked by the emperor, would sacrifice his life to uphold imperial rule, then Haile Selassie had to at least match this effort. Accordingly, it was decided that the royal family would flee via French Somaliland. Emperor Haile Selassie himself would take personal command of the remaining armed forces, leading a push to distribute the nation's remaining arms and supplies among the last remaining reserves of young men conscripted to aid in the defense of the nation. The capital would inevitably fall, but this would not be the end of the war. The imperial armed forces would transition to an insurgency led by the emperor himself, with plans to base this, quote, continuation war, end quote, out of the town of Gore in Ethiopia's western Oromia region. By April 25th, all members of the emperor's immediate family had left the country except for the emperor himself, who reiterated to his men that he would not leave Ethiopia until the enemy did. Throughout the end of April, the Addis Ababa police and imperial guard would oversee an evacuation of all critical assets, from noblemen, intelligence agents, and soldiers to gold and other resources, from the capital to Gore. Police chief Abebe Arigai would quickly distinguish himself in the eyes of the emperor. On May 5, 1936, General Pietro Badoglio entered Addis Ababa to find a city depleted of spoils and people. Silence filled the air as the fascist jackboots marched across the city thoroughfare. The Italians would find the imperial palace empty, with the emperor himself nowhere to be found. By the time the Italians had even reached the city outskirts, the imperial government was already in Gore. Just as predicted, with the fall of Addis Ababa came not the end of the war, but rather the beginning of the Arbanok insurgency. The Arbanok, taking their name from the Amharic word for patriots, represented the continuation of the Ethiopian war effort, an anti-fascist guerrilla movement fighting for one sole purpose, to expel the Italians from Ethiopia. Leading the Arbanok was the emperor, unlike in our timeline where he fled. As his second-in-command, the emperor would appoint Abebe Arigai, former Addis Ababa chief of police, upon whom he would also bestow the honorific title of Ras. Nearly half of the nation remained unoccupied, and from these areas the Arbanok drew strength from tireless recruitment efforts. On the 11th of June, 1936, Pietro Badoglio would be appointed the Viceroy and Governor-General of Italian East Africa, comprising Somalia, Eritrea, and Ethiopia. In the Italian press, it was said that Badoglio had achieved total victory and that Haile Selassie had fled. Nowhere at all was it mentioned that the emperor was in fact heading an insurgency. December 1936 would see the Italians attempt to take Gore and capture or kill the emperor in a failed offensive, which would result in the Italians withdrawing from the area and ensuring that the war would continue well into the next year. The rest of the war would see the two sides come to a stalemate. Rome was reticent to commit more troops to pacify the western grasslands and mountains of Oromia, where the vast majority of Arbanok were based. Likewise, the Arbanok, without any outside support except for some funds raised by black folks within the United States and the Caribbean, were unable to embark on any major offensives against the Italians. However, they were able to hold on to their territories throughout the rest of the 1930s. In effect, the Second Italo-Ethiopian War never ended in the 1930s, unlike in our timeline, where Ethiopian military efforts had largely collapsed by 1937. The emperor himself would soon become accustomed to the difficulties and tribulations of life as a guerrilla leader. At the same time, the emperor also gained a renewed sense of respect for the notion of sovereignty. During his time as a guerrilla, the emperor pledged to himself, and to God, that should he survive to see the liberation of his nation, he would outlaw slavery and work to ensure the various peoples of his empire would be given meaningful autonomy. Soon, Providence would deliver the emperor a chance to make these dreams a reality. On September 1st, 1939, the German Reich would invade the Second Polish Republic, sparking World War II. Symbolically, on this day, the Ethiopian Empire, based in Gore, would declare war on the German Reich. In November 1940, the British would invade Eritrea via Sudan and inflict horrific defeats upon the Italians. The British attack on Eritrea was the sign the Arbanok had been waiting for. Across western Ethiopia, the people rose up. The Arbanok would mobilize and move eastward from their holdings, while those in the occupied areas would launch a surprise attack on the Italian invaders. In Addis Ababa, to raise morale, a military parade would be ordered by General Badoglio. As his motorcade rode through the procession on November 11, 1940, an IED was detonated by the Arbanok, killing many soldiers and civilians, including General Badoglio himself. On November 12th, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani would be named Badoglio's successor as Viceroy and Governor-General of Italian East Africa, while Marshal Graziani wished to exact vengeance via reprisal killings of Ethiopian civilians. he actually never got the chance due to the pressure of the current military situation. December and January would see the British swiftly move across Eritrea, blooding the Italians with consecutive defeats. On March 27th, the British victory at the Battle of Keren would see a complete collapse of Italian rule in Eritrea. On April 1st, 1941, a force of 70,000 British and Kenyan colonial troops, with Prince Asfawossen in tow, would cross the border into Ethiopia from Sudan. On April 5th, father and son would reunite in Gore and launch a major offensive to drive out the Italians from the occupied areas once and for all. April 1941 would see the Italians fighting a devastating two-front war between the British in the northeast in Eritrea and the British and Arbanok in the west from Oromia. By April 25th, the Italians had lost control of most territory outside the capital of Addis Ababa. Even so, it too would fall. On May 5th, 1941, after 5 years of exile in Gore, Emperor Haile Selassie I would triumphantly re-enter Addis Ababa to the jubilation of his people, who knew their emperor had never abandoned them. By May 21st, the Italians in southern Ethiopia had capitulated to the restored Ethiopian Empire, marking the end of the war. Soon after, all Italians were expelled from Ethiopia, and what Ethiopian exiles had not yet returned quickly did so. Unfortunately, Marshal Graziani, the viceroy, had fled before the Ethiopians could exact justice upon him, and so the Italian occupation would end much as in our timeline, but with a major change. The emperor had remained in Ethiopia, and through his experiences during the war, he emerged a changed man. As his first act as the restored emperor of all Ethiopia, Haile Selassie would appoint Abebe Adegai as Prime Minister of Ethiopia, a position he would retain for many years to come. In 1942, Haile Selassie would formally outlaw slavery within the Ethiopian Empire, making good on his promise to himself. Yet much work remained to be done. Utilizing his prestige gained not only from his position as emperor, but also the newfound respect many had gained for him after his decision to stay behind, Haile Selassie would implement a sweeping reform package throughout the 1940s. 1943 would see the creation of a progressive tax plan meant to uplift the average person and begin the defeudalization process. And 1944 would see the passing of land reform across the empire. 1945 would see the government begin to tax the properties of the Ethiopian church and end the special privileges enjoyed by the Ethiopian clergy. Also in 1945, the Ethiopian Empire would join the United Nations as a founding member. In 1948, the Ogaden region, disputed between Ethiopia and Somalia, was granted to Ethiopia, setting up future tensions between the two countries. On February 21, 1950, Rodolfo Graziani would be released from British custody and extradited to Ethiopia, where he would be tried and sentenced to death for war crimes during the Italian invasion. In June 1950, the empire would pledge aid to the Republic of Korea in any way it could, following the beginning of the Korean War. The Ethiopian Empire would send several battalions to support the United Nations in Korea throughout the war. Later that year, on December 2, 1950, the United Nations would adopt Resolution 390, permitting Ethiopian control over Eritrea within a federation. 1952 would see the Eritreans overwhelmingly vote to join Ethiopia in a federation in a vote monitored by the United Nations and deemed free and fair. The Eritrea Autonomous Region of the Ethiopian Empire would have its own constitution, while Ethiopia controlled its finances, defenses, and foreign policy. All Eritreans would be made citizens of the empire. Emperor Haile Selassie, unlike in our timeline, would respect this agreement and never attempt to infringe on the rights of the Eritreans, a mindset shaped by his time leading the Arbanok. Because of this, the Eritrean liberation movement would never form, and Eritrean independence would remain a fringe ideology across the land. Throughout the early 1950s, the Ethiopian Empire would also begin to coordinate heavily with the burgeoning anti-apartheid movement, which was growing in South Africa. Emperor Haile Selassie, viewing it as his responsibility to take action as the leader of the preeminent independent African state, decided to begin bankrolling the anti-apartheid movement quietly. Over the years, this investment would only continue to grow, endearing the Ethiopian Empire to many South Africans. In November 1955, Emperor Haile Selassie would implement his biggest reform yet, the creation of a new constitution for Ethiopia. By his own volition, this constitution would curtail the power of the emperor and turn Ethiopia into a constitutional monarchy, under which political suffrage would be granted to all Ethiopians over the age of 18, and a new parliament of only elected members would be formed. Likewise, a modern educational system would also be created, and all Ethiopians ages 4 to 18 would be given the right to a free and complete public education funded by the taxation of the nobility. Because of the emperor's increased prestige, his efforts to end feudalism were far more successful in this timeline. Likewise, in 1956, his federalization plan, which had thus far been working well in Eritrea, would be expanded, granting every ethnic group the right to freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and the right to speak their own languages and have speakers of those languages accommodated within their local government and schools, provided all citizens of the empire learned Amharic as a secondary language, as it functioned as the national language. Lastly, this plan would restrict Amhara immigration into other ethnic lands to a quota set by the local authorities of each given area. This federalization plan would thereby prevent the devastating Bali Revolt and Ogaden Rebellion, which occurred in Oromia and Ogaden in our timeline in the 1960s, sparked by perceived imperial overreach and the subversion of local authority. In 1956, many members of the bureaucracy of the Tigray region would be purged by the newly empowered local authorities, and this purge would prevent the calamitous effects of the 1958 famine by allowing knowledge of the poor harvest to spread across the nation before people began to die. All in all, these efforts preserved imperial legitimacy amongst all peoples of Ethiopia, a major stepping stone towards the survival of the empire. On January 1st, 1960, the emperor, welcoming in the new year, would announce to the people of his empire that while he would remain emperor, due to his advanced age, he would be devolving his powers to be split between Asfawosen, who would henceforth be known as Prince Regent Amha Selassie, and Prime Minister Abebe Adegai. Through these actions, the emperor would placate the growing reformist sentiments present amongst his subjects, who felt that even with his reforms, Ethiopia needed the leadership of a younger generation. Having handed day-to-day responsibility to Prince Regent Amha Selassie and Abebe Adegai, Emperor Haile Selassie would shift his attention to one of the causes dearest to his heart, Pan-Africanism in the post-colonial era. In 1963, Selassie would oversee the creation of the Organization of African Unity, or OAU for short, an intergovernmental organization dedicated to furthering political and economic ties amongst the newly independent countries of Africa. With 32 participating members, the OAU was founded in Addis Ababa on May 1, 1963, which would also be the day of its inaugural conference. Likewise, it was also during this time that the emperor would begin to speak out in support of the civil rights movement in the United States, praising the nonviolent advocacy of activists like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The 1960s, under the stable regime of Amha Selassie and Abebe Adegai, would also see an explosion of Western investment in Ethiopia. This flurry of investments would be driven by Ethiopia's efforts to modernize and fully utilize its strategically placed coastline to engage and trade along the Red Sea. In tandem with this flood of Western money, in 1965, the Ethiopian Empire, viewed as a bulwark against communism in Africa, would sign mutual defense pacts with many key member states of NATO. A key provision of each defense pact would be an agreement that an allotted number of Ethiopian scholars and students could study abroad in the West every year, and as a result, no educational exchange programs would ever be set up within the communist world, a key part of the rise of communism in Ethiopia in our timeline. As part of these efforts to foment economic prosperity and security, the Ethiopian Empire would also begin to engage in proactive agricultural stockpiling, a wise decision considering many parts of the country were historically dangerously prone to famines. Of particular note would be the Wollo region, in which the government would construct an emergency grain reserve facility financed by taxes on foreign and maritime business on the Eritrean coastline. On January 1, 1965, the emperor, in his New Year's Eve address to the nation, would thank all of Ethiopia's ethnic groups for their contribution to the greatness of the empire. He would also declare, in light of recent advances in society, that feudalism in Ethiopia was now moribund. A key part of this victory was the emperor's ability to work together with the different ethnic groups of the nation and unshackle the post-war government from the nobility by largely staffing it with veterans of the Arbanok, rather than the nobles who'd fled the country. The late 1960s would see the emperor frequently traveling abroad to advocate for Ethiopian interests, utilizing his prestige as an elder statesman and icon of post-colonial Africa. The latter half of the decade would see warm relations with Egypt and Sudan in the interest of maintaining equal access to the Nile River for all countries amicably, as well as a major energy deal struck with Saudi Arabia to ensure the empire's continued success. However, a major issue for this thriving Ethiopian empire in our timeline would be Somalia, its neighbor to the east. A historical rival, Somalia, from the outset of its independence, was hostile to the Ethiopians, viewing them as usurpers and thieves who'd stolen the Ogaden region, a region in western Ethiopia that many Somalis viewed as rightfully theirs. Just as in our timeline, on October 15th, 1969, Somali President Abdirashid Sharmake is assassinated. 2 days later, capitalizing on the chaos and the corruption of the government, the Somali armed forces, led by General Siad Barre, would launch a coup d'etat and establish a Marxist-Leninist military dictatorship under Barre's rule, just as in our timeline. Barre, bestowing upon himself the title of Dear Leader, would enact sweeping reforms meant to centralize power within Mogadishu, organize large-scale public works projects, nationalize all major industries, and begin a rural literacy campaign. By 1971, it would be mandatory to display portraits of Barre in all public buildings. By 1973, this would extend to all private residences as well. Mass killings, censorship, and other human rights violations would be frequent under the totalitarian Barre regime. Little did the Ethiopians know that the only thing dissuading a Somali invasion was the ties the emperor had worked so hard to forge with the West. In 1972, a famine struck the Wollo province. However, thanks to the devolution of power and foresight, Prime Minister Adwa, activating the emergency grain reserves, would coordinate an immediate response in tandem with the Red Cross to prevent the mass starvation and cover-up we saw in our timeline. In 1975, Emperor Haile Selassie, still in excellent health for his old age, would, in a speech delivered in Asmara, applaud the Eritreans for their contributions to the empire. In tandem with the support of the Eritrean parliament, the emperor would reaffirm the continued sovereignty of Eritrea for 50 years, setting 2025 as the goal year for the full incorporation of Eritrea into Ethiopia. The Eritreans, who felt that their voices had been heard, were jubilant at the reaffirmation of their sovereignty, and the Ethiopians were popular enough across Eritrea that the 2025 incorporation plan was able to be accepted. On June 27, 1977, French Somaliland, Ethiopia's neighbor to the northeast, would declare its independence from France as the country of Djibouti following an independence referendum held on May 8, 1977. On July 1, 1977, the Somali Democratic Republic, under the communist regime of Siad Barre, would declare the country of Djibouti to be a construct of French imperialism and rightful Somali territory. On July 4, 1977, Somalia would launch an invasion of Djibouti to, quote, reunify the Somalis of Djibouti with the motherland, end quote. Because the Ethiopian Empire had survived and remained powerful, Siad Barre had been left with no choice but to shelve plans for an invasion of Ethiopia's Ogaden region and instead focused on seizing Djibouti. After a lightning offensive across Djibouti that included a decapitation strike on its government, and which also saw sizable military and financial aid from South Yemen, Cuba, China, and the USSR, on March 23rd, Djibouti would announce its unconditional surrender to Somalia and the dissolution of the country, to the horror of the Western world and the Ethiopian Empire, who had quietly supported Djibouti against Somali aggression. With the end of the Djibouti War, General Siad Barre would announce the annexation of Djibouti and that Greater Somalia had been achieved, heralding the transformation of the Somali Democratic Republic into the People's Republic of Somalia, a one-party state led by the Communist Party of Somalia. General Siad Barre himself would hold supreme power as president, commander-in-chief, and chairman of the Communist Party. The inaction of the Ethiopian Empire, motivated by a desire by Amha Selassie and Prime Minister Adwa to remain at peace save for some arms shipments and allow the West to prop up Djibouti if they so wished, would later be heavily critiqued by future African and Ethiopian historians. In 1979, Emperor Haile Selassie would announce new investments into scientific research in the Awash Valley, where in 1974, Lucy, a specimen of Australopithecus afarensis, was discovered. In the coming decades, archaeological tourism would create major economic and scientific opportunities for the economy and academia of the Ethiopian Empire. Another key area of tourism would be that of Rastafarians, a religious group based in Jamaica who believed that the emperor was the second coming of Jesus Christ, who oftentimes traveled to Ethiopia to visit the land of their god. Ethiopia would ring in the 1980s as a nation on the move, the avatar of a modern and prosperous Africa, an exemplar to what their brothers and sisters across the continent could aspire to be. On July 13, 1985, Ethiopia would host a series of concerts known as Somali Aid, funded by the Imperial government to support up-and-coming Ethiopian artists as well as raise money to fund Somali rebels in their quest to overthrow the Siad Barre regime, which had only grown more dictatorial since their victory in the Djibouti War. Somali aid would later be renounced as a failure, with most of the money meant to fund rebel arms purchases instead going to basic food aid within Somalia once it became apparent how bad the situation was internally. A difficult task, considering Somalia had largely closed itself off to the world, save for the Warsaw Pact countries, China, South Yemen, and Cuba. On December 17, 1985, Abebe Adegai, who had faithfully served Emperor Haile Selassie for 44 years as Prime Minister of the Ethiopian Empire, would pass away in his sleep due to old age. He was 82 years old. In his place, the Ethiopian Parliament, with the Emperor's consent via the Prince Regent, would nominate Governor of Eritrea Isaias Afwerki to be the new Prime Minister. Afwerki, who had grown up in the empire's public school system, was well known nationwide due to his work in the 1970s as a human rights lawyer and activist who worked tirelessly to ensure all ethnic groups across the empire lived free of discrimination and were able to peacefully participate in the democratic process. After a unanimous vote, Afwerki would become the second post-war Prime Minister of Ethiopia, swearing fealty to the emperor at his inauguration. The elevation of an Eritrean to a position of such power, and the empire's acceptance of this, only highlighted how far Ethiopia had come in terms of national unity. In 1991, in response to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, Prime Minister Afwerki would pledge Ethiopian participation in the Gulf War coalition in tandem with the empire's allies in the West. The victory over Iraq would be celebrated nationwide the following year. On May 5, 1993, 52 years to the day after the liberation of Addis Ababa, Emperor Haile Selassie, aged 100, would pass away in the midst of his evening meal, leaving behind a legacy so accomplished that it ensured his memory would live on in the world's memory for decades to come. For Ethiopia itself, the memory of the emperor would be eternal. The crown prince and regent, Amha Selassie, would ascend the throne as His Imperial Majesty Emperor Amha Selassie I, elect of God, conquering lion of the tribe of Judah and king of kings of Ethiopia. Emperor Amha Selassie would reign over Ethiopia until his death from a stroke on January 17, 1997, at the age of 80. Amha Selassie's successor would be his son, Crown Prince Zere Yacob Amha Selassie, who would ascend the imperial throne as His Imperial Majesty Emperor Zere Yacob I. The Ethiopian Empire would enter the 21st century with a booming and rapidly diversifying economy, a united and non-polarized diverse population, and a powerful culture which had become known the world over. Under the watchful eye of Emperor Zere Yacob, the empire would flourish. After 19 years in office, in 2004, following backlash for his support of the American invasion of Iraq, Prime Minister Afwerki would resign his post after a vote of no confidence, replaced by Hailu Shaul, a civil engineer turned politician who styled himself as a populist and man of the people. Shaul would remain in office until his retirement in 2014, wherein he would be replaced by Hirute Gebre Selassie, who would become the first female Prime Minister of Ethiopia, managing through good governance to stay in power well into 2025. By the 2020s, the Ethiopian economy would be on track to be one of the world's largest economies, and by the 2030s it would be the largest economy in Africa. To the east, Ethiopian intelligence remained vigilant with their eyes trained on the People's Republic of Somalia. After the death of dear leader General Siad Barre in 1995, he was replaced by his son, great leader General Masla Barre. However, the totalitarian state was of no real concern aside from the occasional missile tests. In 2025, the Ethiopian Empire would stand as tall as it always had, a beacon of light for the rest of Africa to follow. Although, thanks to time healing the wounds inflicted by colonialism, the rest of the continent was quickly catching up. But this was no problem for the Ethiopians, for progress had never been a race. All they'd ever wanted to see was their fellow African nations succeed, under the watchful eye of the emperor.